extremely wicked, shockingly evil, and vile, starring Zac Efron. Okay, I don't know if anyone here is aware, but the Sundance Film Festival just released today a Ted Bundy biopic starring the uh, Disney boy star from High School Musical. For those of you who remember that, gosh, seems like that was 15 years ago, and he looks like him. It's crazy. So, recap. For those of you who don't know who Ted Bundy is, he was a notorious, almost celebrity status serial killer. And this was not some toothless, uh, mountain person, some incestuous, inbred psychopath, that you would stereotypically, I guess, associate with violent animalistic tendencies that were very characteristic of how Ted Bundy treated his victims. Um, he was a handsome, charming, debonair, and this is from third party, witnesses that knew him, that went to school with him, that grew up with him. The one of the survivors, there was going to be a potential victim of his. I forgot her name, but he was not an obvious monster or beastly type person. He was a well-groomed, intelligent, handsome, charming man, at least for his time. And he grew up in a very stable home, a Christian home, actually, for that matter, and not a latently Christian home. They were very profound in their faith, and he attended Sunday school every week. Was part of the Boy Scouts. Um, he was very involved in the community growing up, and he got into politics later. And, had ambitions and aspirations to someday become president. He got involved in a lot of political campaigns, and I don't believe that he successfully um, became an attorney or not. I know that he attended law school, but I haven't finished the entire documentary that I recently started on Netflix. It's episodic. I don't know how many episodes are there. I'm only in like 2 episodes so far, and it's great. It's a great documentary, and I really want to see the Zac Efron film because he looks like kind of a modernized, boyishly charming version of Ted Bundy. It's an uncanny resemblance. So we'll see if his acting chops can match the quality of the physique that they were able to uh, do for this film. Very impressive. I haven't seen any footage. I know the film was released today, but I have not seen any footage online. I've only seen a couple of photos released on Instagram, so that might be something I'll need to revisit later. But I'm really looking forward to that movie. Um, Interesting thing about Ted Bundy is, yes, he was a serial killer, but he was very unique, I guess, in terms of other celebrity status serial killers like Jeffrey Dahmer. He was the cannibal. That was his theme or motif, I guess you could say. With Ted Bundy, he typically victimized the women that he courted. They wouldn't be necessarily random women. Some of them were, but a lot of them he actually would date, court, or take on a date. And obviously, there was some sort of sociopathic or psychopathic tendency, some sort of emotional disconnect. He admitted that he did not know how to really function with women. One particular woman whom I believe he never actually harmed, he almost married. And I'm terrible with names, so I don't recall her name, but she was part of multiple interviews over the years, just with journalists that inquired of greater detail of some of this happening before he was ever convicted of these crimes, of these murders. But whether it was strangling or stabbing, um, he would kill them, and he was also, I believe, a necrophiliac. So some of the abuse that he uh, committed, sexual abuse no less, was after he had murdered the victim. So there was a very bizarre, unique pattern with him in that endeavor. And ultimately, he was convicted of, I don't know how many of the crimes, maybe all of them, but they eventually he was convicted of the crime and not only in prison, but on death row. And to kind of bring this full circle, the irony is that Dr. James Dobson, who is more or less the head honcho of Focus on the Family, a Judeo-Christian organization, um, he interviewed Ted Bundy the day before his actual execution. So within the last 24 hours of terminating Ted Bundy, Dr. James Dobson, I believe, was the last person or one of the last people outside of the prison compound to interview him. And that footage is actually on YouTube. You can find that for free online. It's a really interesting, engaging conversation those two have. And really, their conversation, what materialized from that was more of a warning to others out there regarding pornographic addictions or pornography addictions, because what Ted Bundy had told Dr. James Dobson was that these violent tendencies he can trace all the way back to an addiction he had developed with pornography. And he said that he was raised in a Christian home and knew the faith, and obviously knew that these were, obviously murder was wrong. That's kind of a universal understanding, with us as a society. But he said that there was something different, something clicked with him with pornography, and the sexual drive just kind of over time incrementally became more and more violent. So it wasn't so much that he became addicted to the sexuality, but he became addicted to the uh, violent aspect of it. So there must have been some more niche uh, type of adult content he was viewing, and it was just a slow fade. And I don't believe that he was implying that anyone who struggles with that sort of material and that is wanting to get away from that sort of material is inevitably going to become, some raving lunatic serial killer. But it was still interesting to just think about that this is a man who knows he's going to die in 24 hours. And when pressed for an answer, he very confidently uh, specifies that as the big warning. It wasn't, stay away from guns, kids, or, I don't know, violent cartoons or something like that, or video games. I'm a 90s baby, so that was one of the big scares was, increasingly violent video games. And of course, you've got, multiple sides to that argument. You've got the people that say, well, it's the video games can induce that violence in somebody. Others would say there already has to be some sort of pre-existing mental condition with the person that the video games would just kind of uh, trigger or bring out of them to the surface. Something that might be maybe the mental condition is a bit dormant, and then something flips. When video games are played, almost like having a seizure. It's like you don't just people who are predisposed to having seizures. They don't just have seizures, all the time. But there are triggers, that can induce it, and so that's probably one of the bigger, stronger arguments with the violent video games is that you have these things about video games, the engagement and the violence that can trigger what otherwise was a dormant issue or mental condition that maybe you didn't even realize you had, and maybe your parents or significant other didn't know you had. Um, but case in point, whether it's video games or pornography or something else, I think that the issue that Ted was addressing was simply, look, I don't know if I just had a bunch of other issues that medical science hasn't been able to address yet, and this happens to be the trigger in my life, but it could be something different in someone else's life, namely the pornography, or maybe that really could be the cause and effect that someone could get involved and develop an addiction, and if making the wrong choice or set off the wrong trajectory from that can result in something catastrophic. So that was a really interesting dichotomy with him, and it was interesting that it came back full circle. That it's like you're raised in a very devout religious home, and in this case, a Judeo-Christian home for that matter, and yet you develop this um, addiction, and instead of it being like probably most people who may have that addiction, you just kind of uh, don't talk about it, and that's it. You don't usually act out violently, but somehow that's what happened to him, and then eventually he became a murderer, and then ultimately he was tried, convicted, and then executed for it. Um, but then I guess part of the if you want to call it a redemption story to some extent with him as an individual, uh, the punishment fit the crime, right? So, he definitely paid a major debt with his life. Um, but in those final days, it was interesting to see everything come back to his upbringing and then to warn others about it. So I think that you probably couldn't have asked for more from an individual like him. Uh, you know, Obviously, other than bring your loved ones back from the dead, but for what was in his control, that was pretty amazing that happened. And that's probably easy for me to say because I'm obviously not related to any of the victims. So, it's not as though it's easier for me to, I guess, be somewhat sympathetic to that sort of redemption. Whereas if I was related to the victims, I might not be so, you know, easygoing about it. But that said, the documentary is fantastic, and if anyone has seen the Zac Efron movie, let me know what you thought of it because I'd love to see it. And in relation to writing, because we got to bring it back to that somehow, uh, it comes back down to dichotomies. I love dichotomies in stories. I love twists. I love redemption. Maybe that's what we should emphasize here. I like to see redeemable characters. Um, the good guy that starts off good and goes a little crooked, but then brings it back full circle. Um, the antagonist, the bad guy, quote unquote, who gets up on the wrong foot, but eventually, whether it's in the last few days of his life or her life, or maybe he survives whatever the challenge is in the end, that there is this redemption, there is this turning away from the darkness, from the evil, and becoming a new person, a new creature, and starting a new life, for yourself. I think those are the most fun stories to write about and to read about, and I think some of the greatest literature is probably wrapped around that. And not everything's a fairy tale, and you leave that up to Disney. The one-dimensional fairy tale, happy ending stuff. Let Disney do that for the kids. But when you become an adult, you kind of want to have something to really sink your teeth into. You leave the milk for the babes, and the meat is for the adults. Something that you really gotta chew on. After you leave the theater, after you walk away from the book, or what have you. So that's going to be the buzzword today is dichotomy. The dichotomy of the individual. To consider that That might just be my theme for the whole year 2019 as far as the writing goes, is to always consider dichotomies when you're writing um, any sort of character in fiction or in nonfiction. Again, to be as unbiased and unprejudiced as possible, you have to understand both sides of the argument, or if there's more than two sides, understand all sides of the given argument. And really, I think the best way to go about that is to consider the dichotomy, consider the individual or whatever the issue is, not as 100% purely one way or the other, even if it is, even if there's compelling evidence that it's 100% one way or the other, that there is no spectrum. Still try to look at it hypothetically as a spectrum, just so you can get the creative juices flowing. And that, I think, will open up a much broader scope on how to really analyze and process and contextualize the issue in a way that you might not have seen before, or that anyone else has seen before. And that makes it far more interesting and engaging to discuss with other people and to write about and to share. And again, I think it comes back down to dichotomy. So don't understand everything as 100% black or 100% white when you're writing. You can still, your own personal opinion can be it's 100% this way or that way. But when you're writing, be unbiased, be unprejudiced, put the binaries away, look at it in a spectrum, understand it as a dichotomy.